In 1979, Ridley Scott's Alien released, and while it wasn't immediately apparent, it would go on to change science fiction forever. It inspired countless filmmakers and franchises over the following decades, and today is widely recognized as a cornerstone of the science fiction genre. And 3 years later, Ridley Scott decided to revolutionize the genre yet again. 1982's Blade Runner is another cornerstone of science fiction, and has more than earned its cult classic status. Visually, it almost independently created what we now refer to as the cyberpunk genre. Considering the reputation Blade Runner has today, it may come as a surprise to learn that it wasn't well received upon release. It struggled both critically and at the box office. Not only that, but the making of Blade Runner had been its own ordeal as well. There were times during its production where it looked like the film may not release at all. Plagued by infighting, studio interference, and a tight budget, Blade Runner never should have worked. Yet somehow it became one of the most influential films ever made. Today I'll be diving into Blade Runner to find out how it became the icon it is today and why it's maintained this status. Also in the coming weeks, I'll be taking a look at its sequel, Blade Runner 2049. Without further ado though, let's get into Ridley Scott's cult classic, Blade Runner. In 1968, renowned science fiction author Philip K. Dick released the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It told the story of Rick Deckard, a bounty hunter who hunts down and kills androids on a post-apocalyptic Earth. And almost immediately, there was plenty of interest in creating a film adaptation of the story. It wasn't until 1977, however, that screenwriter Hampton Fancher would write a screenplay adaptation that was finally optioned. It was film producer Michael Dealey that took interest in Fancher's draft, and he asked Ridley Scott to direct it. Scott actually rejected the opportunity at first, as he was currently developing a film adaptation of Frank Herbert's iconic novel, Dune. Overwhelmed by both that production and the recent passing of his older brother, Ridley Scott decided that he needed a change of pace, and decided to direct the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep adaptation instead. And potentially realizing that the project would need a snappier title, Scott had Dealey obtain the rights to a completely different novel titled The Blade Runner. Scott officially signed on in February of 1980, and soon after was able to convince Filmways, the production company, to increase the project's budget from $13 million to $15 million. With that, it would seem like they were ready to begin production on Blade Runner, but there was one small problem. Philip K. Dick hated Hampton Fancher's draft of the screenplay. This perhaps motivated Ridley Scott to hire screenwriter David Peoples to rewrite the script, and Dick vastly preferred Peoples' draft. Peoples gave much of the credit for his superior draft to Ridley Scott, claiming that Scott was involved with every level of scripting. He also gave credit to Fancher's script and to actors Harrison Ford and Rutger Hauer for their contributions on set in reworking the dialogue. Now with a superior script and the author's approval, Blade Runner looked like it could soon enter production. At the last second though, Filmways, the company financing the production, backed out. Amazingly, in just 10 days though, producer Michael Dealey managed to secure $21.5 million for the production in a three-way deal involving the Ladd Company. And finally, Blade Runner could begin filming. The production from here on wouldn't be without its troubles though. While $21.5 million may sound like a large budget, considering the ambitious setting Scott had in mind, creating this world would still be a challenge. Sid Mead was hired as a concept artist, and really did a great job of showing what this world could be. The problem was that turning these complex environments into a functional set that met Ridley Scott's expectations was frankly impossible. The art department, art director, and production designers did an incredible job with what they had, but in the end, Scott still wasn't entirely satisfied with the street sets. Ridley Scott is infamous for being very detail-oriented and a perfectionist on his productions, and that includes Blade Runner, which caused quite a bit of friction with both the cast and crew. Harrison Ford and Scott disagreed on multiple occasions over various things, but often it would be over the delays Scott would cause by making sure the set was perfect before filming. And naturally, this slow, meticulous approach was also incredibly expensive, which caused friction with the higher-ups as well. Ultimately, Scott had to do something about the street sets he was dissatisfied with, but by this point, he didn't have either the time or money to really change them in any significant way. And out of this dissatisfaction is where some of the most iconic visuals of the cyberpunk genre were born. Scott decided that the only thing that could be done with the cheap-looking sets, as he thought, was to cover them up. He did so with a combination of rain, smoke, and darkness, all features that would later become synonymous with the cyberpunk genre. And obscuring these environments also does a great job of playing into the mystery and noir aesthetics of the story. Credit also needs to go to the cinematographer, Jordan Cronenweth, for lighting and shooting these sets in a way that both obscured their imperfections and made the world of Blade Runner captivating. Another excellent aid in creating the world of Blade Runner is the incredible soundtrack by Vangelis. The role of Blade Runner's soundtrack cannot be overstated within this narrative. The reputation Blade Runner has garnered can in no small part be attributed to the score, while it would likely still be remembered as a cult classic. In all honesty, I don't know if we're talking about Blade Runner the way we do today had it not been for its iconic score. In many ways, Blade Runner was ahead of its time, and the soundtrack is a prime example of that. The problem with being ahead of your time, though, is that you won't get the respect you deserve initially. Such was the case with Blade Runner. Negative responses to test screenings caused many changes to be made to the version that would be released theatrically. One such change was the addition of a voiceover by Harrison Ford. The initial drafts of Blade Runner apparently had featured some narration. However, Scott and Ford had decided that it would make more sense to simply show the audience key plot details. Test audiences allegedly found the film confusing though, so the narration was not only added back in, but also new bits of narration were written to fill in some gaps. Both Ridley Scott and Harrison Ford were strongly against this decision, which is expressed by Ford's delivery of the lines. On top of all that, the studio also demanded that a new, happier ending be added, which again upset Ridley Scott. In this state, with the narrative tampered with in such fundamental ways, and both the lead actor and director dissatisfied, Blade Runner released. And not surprisingly, it received mixed reviews. Of course, it still featured the impressive visual effects, unique setting, and incredible soundtrack that are widely praised even today. But in many ways, the Blade Runner audiences saw in 1982 is very different from the one that's commonly discussed today. Nowadays, there's many versions of Blade Runner, all distinct from one another. And depending on which version a viewer decides to watch, they'll have a completely different idea of what the film is even about. There's 5 major versions of Blade Runner. Those include the work print, domestic theatrical release, international theatrical release, the 1992 director's cut, and the 2007 final cut. There's quite a few differences between each, but if you're just looking for which version you should watch, go with the 2007 final cut. It is far and away the best version of Blade Runner in my eyes. As far as differences go, there are 3 key changes between the versions. The theatrical releases feature voiceover by Harrison Ford throughout, while every other version omits the voiceover. The theatrical versions also feature a unique ending that concludes the story on a much more positive note. This again is omitted in every other release. And finally, there's the Unicorn Dream sequence, which is only featured in the 1992 director's cut and 2007 final cut. I'll get further into the implications of that later, but for now, just know that it isn't in the work print or either of the theatrical releases. How did we end up with so many different versions of Blade Runner though? Well, as was mentioned, test audiences were shown a different version of Blade Runner than the one that would be released theatrically. This version is now commonly referred to as the work print. Before most audiences would see this version officially though, Blade Runner released theatrically with 2 distinct versions. The domestic theatrical release censored several moments of violence. Meanwhile, the international theatrical release left those scenes unaltered. While the 2 versions do feature those small changes, they are more or less the same film. They both feature the narration, happy ending, and omit the Unicorn Dream sequence. And for a while, those were the only versions of Blade Runner known to exist. That would all change in October of 1989, when film preservationist Michael Eric discovered a 70mm print of Blade Runner. Upon hearing news of this discovery, management at the Fairfax Theater asked Warner Brothers for permission to screen it at the Fairfax 70mm Film Festival in May of 1990. Allegedly, it wasn't known until the screening that this was actually the work print version of Blade Runner. Positive audience responses to this showing motivated Warner Brothers to give the work print a limited theatrical release, which they labeled as the original director's cut. Ridley Scott had publicly disowned this version, however, and wanted nothing to do with it. And with every one of these limited showings selling out, Warner knew that there was interest in a proper director's cut of Blade Runner. So in 1992, an official director's cut was released. Although calling this a director's cut was also a bit disingenuous. Although Scott had approved this version, he didn't actually work on it. While this version did remove the narration and happy ending, as well as adding in the Unicorn Dream sequence, Ridley Scott still didn't see it as complete. This director's cut still featured many technical errors from the original release. So finally, in the mid-2000s, Ridley Scott was put in charge of one definitive re-release of Blade Runner, where he had complete artistic control, aptly named the Final Cut. And in 2007, this version released. It featured all the changes from the director's cut, this time with remastered visuals, an extended unicorn dream sequence, and added back in some moments of violence from the international release. Ridley Scott viewed this as his true, complete director's cut, and the work put into this release really is impressive. The effort that went into fixing what most would see as only minor issues is fascinating. For example, to fix one scene where Harrison Ford's mouth movement didn't match up with what he was saying, they needed a look-alike to re-record the scene. So they asked Harrison Ford's son, Benjamin Ford, to come in and then superimposed his mouth onto the scene. Everyone involved really went the extra mile to make sure this was the best version of Blade Runner possible. With all that being said, I want to make one thing clear. While the final cut is the definitive version of the film, that's not to say the others are bad. The only reason we ever even got different versions of Blade Runner is because audiences enjoyed the first one. It's unlikely many people would have showed up to the original director's cut release if it wasn't for audiences growing to respect the theatrical release as time had gone on. At the end of the day, the only reason different versions were allowed to be made was because they were profitable. While the theatrical release may be flawed, underneath its shoddy voiceover and technical mistakes was a captivating world that drew in audiences everywhere. And as time has gone on, the respect audiences have for Blade Runner only increases. This is, of course, in part due to the many improvements made by the final cut, but also because of a growing appreciation for aspects of the narrative that have been there from the beginning. While Blade Runner may technically be based on the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, in practice, they share very few similarities. Other than character names and the general premise, they work fairly independently from one another. That being said, the novel and film do complement each other very well. The novel improves the film as it fleshes out this world even further, and the film improves the novel by bringing this environment to life with both its incredible visuals and soundtrack. Blade Runner features the same precision present in many of Ridley Scott's movies, and with how complex these sets are, it's even more impressive. Every shadow, puff of smoke, subtle glow, and lingering expression carries weight. Of course, as director, Scott deserves credit for this, but really, this is a credit to everyone involved with this production. Blade Runner truly is an incredible feat in filmmaking, especially for its time. Creating a world like this in an era before CGI seems impossible to even consider. Blade Runner used almost every known technique and technology at the time and pushed it to the limit. The film isn't just a technical showcase though. Rather, its unique environment feels fully realized. To compare it to another science fiction cult classic from the era, Tron, which released just a month after Blade Runner, features some impressive filmmaking technology that had never been seen before. And while it may not hold up very well today, I still greatly respect what it was attempting to do and find some enjoyment in it. A lot of that enjoyment, though, comes retroactively after having seen Tron Legacy, where the technology had caught up with the vision of the filmmakers. In Legacy, the world of Tron, or the grid as it's called, feels like a fully realized environment. It's full of life, and everything is perfectly stylized to fit into this world. And while the story of Legacy does attempt to explain the progression between the movies, it still doesn't change the fact that the original Tron would have been seen as a narrative with much wasted potential were it not for its sequel. And while this is true in some ways for Blade Runner and its subsequent sequel, for the most part, I never felt when watching the original Blade Runner that there was much missed potential, at least not visually. At the time of its release, Blade Runner didn't take place that far into the future, so while advancements had clearly been made, there is still a sense of familiarity. Because of just how dark and decrepit the city is though, the setting is also somewhat eerie, which is reflected well through the score. While Blade Runner is known for its futuristic setting and science fiction elements, at its core, it's a fairly typical noir story, one that is engaging enough all things considered. People often complain that Blade Runner is boring, but I never found that to be the case. While the narrative does admittedly take a backseat to the setting, when this much effort went into that setting, it's easy to see why. And to bring up Tron once more, Blade Runner feels much more like a fully realized story, whereas Tron is more of a proof of concept. I think what people actually mean to complain about when they criticize the narrative are the characters. The job Rick Deckard is doing is interesting, and the way he goes about it is compelling as well. The problem is that he isn't compelling. During quiet moments when he's doing his detective work, like the infamous photo analysis scene, I only think it's a bit boring because Deckard isn't interesting. We know nothing about his backstory, which is intentional, but it comes at the cost of having nothing to latch onto with his character. And while his arc throughout the story of learning to view replicants as more than just machines is interesting, it isn't handled perfectly. Really, everything I've mentioned up to this point doesn't bother me all too much. I do have one legitimate concern though. My one complaint is the quote-unquote love scene. I understand what the film was trying to do. Deckard is teaching this emotionless android how to love. This could have easily been communicated by depicting Rachel as unresponsive or confused, although even in this case, her ability to consent would be dubious at best. Still, it would have been better than what we got, where Rachel is shown to be helpless and terrified, which transforms this love scene into an assault. And I don't think this was the intention at all, given that their relationship is an integral part of the narrative. So what went wrong? Well, it's a mix of two things. First is the unfortunate reality that the script passed through several hands, and during the writing of multiple drafts, the intent of the scene seems to have been lost. And the second issue is the simple fact that Harrison Ford and Sean Young have no chemistry. To put it bluntly, the pair just did not like each other on set. As I alluded to, any attempt at saving this scene was likely doomed, as the concept itself is contentious. Combine that with a complete lack of chemistry between the actors and the intention of the scene being unclear, and it was never going to work. The worst part is that you could just end the scene with Rachel leaving Deckard's apartment, and the story doesn't change much. We get her confession of love to Deckard in the film's final moments anyway, so we don't need a love scene to confirm the relationship between the characters. I mentioned earlier how the characters in Blade Runner are lackluster, but that isn't true of them all. Rutger Hauer's character, Roy Batty, proved to be not only a compelling character, but a key reason why this film is looked upon the way it is. While Roy does horrible things in his quest for a mere extension of his 4-year lifespan, it's important to note how unjust this system is in the first place. Replicants are viewed as nothing more than slaves, objects to be used and thrown away once their purpose is served. While it'd be easy to look at him as a murderer, he could just as easily be looked at as someone fighting against oppression. One scene I found particularly interesting is when Roy finally confronts his creator, Eldon Tyrell. Earlier in the story, when Roy speaks to James Honk's character, a parallel is created between Roy and the devil when he mentions angels falling. His creator, or father as he calls him, lives in a massive pyramid situated far above the common people. Every scene in Tyrell's tower also has this ethereal, dreamlike quality, furthering this connection to heaven. In a sense, Roy has been cast out, sent down to terrorize the common people in the short time he has left. Parallels to the Christian faith can be found in most American media, but in Blade Runner they're especially evident and are featured all throughout. There's even an allusion to Jesus when Roy drives a nail through his palm to restore feeling to his hand. And this leads to yet another scene I love. Upon finding out there is truly no salvation in store, Roy becomes manic. Roy terrorizes Deckard, teaching him a lesson in fear, and showing him what it was like to be on the opposing side of these so-called Blade Runners. Yet with Deckard utterly defeated, Roy uses the last of his strength to save him. And this is where I find myself disagreeing with most fans' analysis of the film. Most agree that Roy saves Deckard because he's choosing mercy over revenge, and he now understands the value of life. So basically he decides he should at least save Deckard's if he can't save his own. And while this is a possibility, and this explanation is spelled out for the audience in the narration featured in the theatrical release, it's not my preferred understanding of the scene. Instead, I believe that Roy explains his motive for saving Deckard just moments later. After he pulls Deckard to safety, Roy delivers one of the most iconic monologues in film history. Roy recounts some of the most beautiful scenes he's experienced in his life, and laments how once he dies, these moments will be lost, like tears in rain. By saving Deckard, though, the memory of Roy will live on in him. In a sense, Roy has found a way to achieve his goal of extending his life by means of Deckard. The Tears in Rain scene truly is special. In my opinion, this is the scene that definitively makes Blade Runner a masterpiece. Yes, its setting and production value were revolutionary and iconic, but the Tears in Rain scene adds an emotional core that would otherwise be sorely lacking. Rutger Hauer also came up with the Tears in Rain line the day before filming apparently, and without it, I can guarantee you that I wouldn't be talking about the film today. The line is emotionally dense, as it's not only an amazing parallel to the effect the passage of time has on the memory of those who've died, but it also simply implies that Roy is crying in this moment and it's being obscured by the rain. Even as a replicant, he feels this moment the same as any human would. The monologue really stuck with me personally because of the examples Roy gives of outstanding memories. They're simply beautiful scenes that he's witnessed. I first watched Blade Runner just before leaving on a vacation, and each time I saw something I wouldn't soon forget, in the back of my mind was the melancholic reminder that this moment will inevitably disappear. No matter how much I long to hold on to it, even if I manage to recall it for a lifetime, it eventually will be lost to the stream of time, as I inevitably pass and all my memories along with. The monologue also made me reflect on the fact that I do spend a lot of time alone. No, there's nothing wrong with that, but I came to the realization that there's an entire world that only exists to me. And when I'm gone, that world will come to an end. The way I perceive things, the moments that make up core elements of my being, as important as they are to me as an individual, they mean nothing against the steady passage of time. Though we may live longer than just 4 years, like Roy, any attempt at extending our lifespan will ultimately prove fruitless. Blade Runner presents just one hope against this unstoppable force: posterity. While we all will eventually pass on, like Roy saving Deckard in his final moments, we can make our mark on the people around us and live on through them. While this still may all sound hopeless and may not be the answer we'd like to hear, it really is beautiful in a sense. Our lives aren't measured by what we accomplished or whatever legacy we've built. Instead, they're defined by the effect we have on the people around us. We don't waste our lives by not doing enough in the time we have, but instead by closing ourselves off and not sharing enough with the people in our lives. The fact that all of this can be gleaned from a 42-word monologue in an 80s science fiction movie is evidence of the power of storytelling. And it's a testament to the many talented individuals that played a role in Blade Runner's creation. Since the dawn of time, humans have been telling stories, not just to entertain, but also to learn things about one another and themselves, to impart lessons, and to express themselves creatively. And Blade Runner, for all its imperfections, checks all of these boxes. It introduced audiences to a captivating new world. It practically invented the look of cyberpunk. It furthered the legacies of individuals like Ridley Scott, Harrison Ford, and Rutger Hauer. And it forced audiences to really confront their own mortality. On top of all that, it left audiences with questions that are still commonly discussed to this day. The most common one being whether or not Deckard is a replicant. And my answer to that is that it depends what version you're watching. In the work print and theatrical release, no, he isn't. In the director's and final cut though, he most likely is. Any version that includes the unicorn daydream basically tells the audience that he's a replicant in the final moments when Gaff leaves the unicorn origami outside his apartment. Personally, I've never found this debate all too interesting. Regardless of how I feel about it, this question is an essential part of the legacy of Blade Runner. And of all the films considered to be some of the greatest ever made, Blade Runner's legacy is among the most complex. Whether it be for its complicated production, many distinct versions, revolutionary setting, iconic moments, or unanswered questions, Blade Runner is a film that is not easily forgotten, and may well prove to be an immovable fixture against the unstoppable passage of time. Thanks for watching.